ExamPal.
So let's start. Again, going back to our experience as teachers, and especially mine, I found that students tend to go through more or less 4 stages of learning the material. So the first stage, and this is sort of what I called learning the ropes before, is just flat out learning the material. So learning what the remainder equation is, learning how to work with right angle triangles, remembering what Pythagoras means, and not fainting from the Greek name. Practicing your reading comprehension skills. We do recommend that our students read every day. This is not something that you should overlook, especially if you're not a native English speaker, this sort of thing. So this can take a while. Especially if your math is a little bit rusty, or if you're not a native English speaker. If you have quite a bit of work to do in order, and especially if you're aiming for a high score, it can take a while to just learn all of the material. The second stage that students go through is to apply the material. So this is, for example, well, you showed us that question about 3x and 2y before, and I know how fractions work, I know how equations work, but I just didn't see it, I didn't see the solution, I didn't know what to do. And I had no choice but to plug in numbers because I knew I didn't know what else to do. And so this is the second stage. So this is a little bit more refined than just flat out going to learn the material. This is learning the different types of approaches. This is recognizing the different types of traps that the GMAT loves to use. And you have traps both in quant sections, like standardized traps, and especially in verbal sections. So in verbal sections, in critical reasoning and reading comprehension especially, you can really identify different types of wrong answer choices, and you sort of know what to look for. So this is sort of the second stage. How do I apply all of the sort of basic material that I learned? The third stage is sort of where people usually get stuck, the third and the fourth stages. So the first 2 stages are usually first-timers or retakers who are sort of building themselves up to the exam. The third stage is when you've sort of learned all of the material and you're making really silly mistakes. Oh my God, I didn't notice that it said a positive number, or oh, I forgot about 0, or I just assumed for some reason that, I don't know, that it was a square and not just a rectangle, or the lines were parallel, or something like that. Or in critical reasoning questions, often what the GMAT likes to do is it likes to put answer choices that are opposite from the right answer choice. So if in a critical reasoning question you're asked to strengthen a statement, then I can almost guarantee you that one of the answer choices in front of you will weaken the statement. And so you'll see an answer choice which looks totally relevant to the question, and you'll forget that it has the opposite effect, and you'll mark it and you'll move on. And these types of mistakes can be very frustrating to deal with. There are all kinds of tools, but that's not the topic for today's webinar. That's a topic for a different webinar. Today's webinar is going to focus on timing. And several of you wrote in chat that you just don't have enough time, either because doing the math takes you too long, or because you reach the end of the exam and you haven't left yourself enough time available because there's a specific passage that takes you too long. All kinds of different reasons for not having enough time. And like I said, these last 2 phases are sort of at the polish stage. So they're sort of the glass ceiling that often prevents many students from reaching their full potential. And so we're going to address timing today. And before we dive in, I just want to say that timing is so important that even the GMAT, who are the people that write the GMAT, have talked about timing. And so we had the privilege of doing an interview with them a few weeks back. You can go watch the full interview on YouTube. I just want to share one slide with you here. And this slide essentially separates between people who finish the exams and people who don't finish the exams. And so this is divided into 3 groups. So the y-axis is the average section score. So, people around the 45 on the y-axis, these are high scores. It doesn't matter for the moment if it's verbal or quant. People in the middle are middle scores around the 35, and people towards the bottom around 20 scores. Scores with around a 20 section score. And the x-axis is how many questions were left either unanswered or guessed. So the orange lines are students or simulations who finished the exam. And I see that you're writing additional questions on the chat. I would ask that you can write them in for sure, but I'll have pause points throughout the webinar when I go through them and sort of I reply to them. But for the moment, we're just going to go with the webinar. So orange lines are students who finished the entire exam and they guessed the last few questions. So they either guessed 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 questions, depending on the x-axis. And the yellow lines are students who left the last questions blank. And again, this might be simulations. This is official GMAT data. I don't know exactly how they generated it. But the key point, the key take-home message from the slide, and the reason that I'm showing it, is that there's a difference of about 3, and that's an enormous amount. That's like 10 percentile points, more or less, at this range in the quant, for the quant section, between people who finished the section by guessing. And note that these aren't people who managed to answer all of the questions. These are people who guessed on most of the last questions. There's a 3 points difference between guessing all of the last 5 questions and leaving them blank. So again, the goal of this slide is to show, A, that you should always finish your exam. So for those of you who said that you don't have enough time left, we're going to talk about that in a second, but you never want to get to that point. If you do get to that point, then you should just take the last minute to guess whatever you have left. But definitely don't leave any questions unanswered. And sort of that's one take-home message from the slide. And the second take-home message is that timing is so important that even the GMAT talks about it in our interview with them. Okay, so let's start out with the big picture. And as you know, there are 31 questions in the quant section, which is about 2 minutes per question. And there are 36 questions in the verbal section, so that's about 1:50 per question. And the natural strategy, the basic timing strategy number 1, that pretty much everyone talks about, is to basically spread out your time evenly. And this is mainly to prevent you from getting to situations like people have mentioned before, where you just don't have enough time at the end of the exam. And the way to do this is, for quant in this case, is to answer 5 questions every 10 minutes. So you don't have to be sort of OCD and looking at the clock time. The recommendation is every 5 questions, check the clock and you look at where you are. If you're at 10 minutes, then you're cool. If you find after 5 questions you're already at 15 minutes, then something's gone wrong. You've wasted too much time on a question, and what you need to do is skip a question. And the general idea behind this is that you do not want to skip several questions in a row. And I've sort of seen this, you can also see this on the practice exams that you do. Excuse me. Skipping several questions in a row hurts your score much, much worse than spreading out your skips. So for example, if I know that I don't have enough time and someone is, for example, writing that it takes them 3 or 3.5 minutes to solve questions that are very wordy, if you know that you don't have enough time to answer all of your questions, don't even try. It'll hurt your score much more than if you try to answer 4 out of 5 questions. So you answer 4 questions, and out of, say, the first 5 questions, pick that one question that you don't get, and you skip it. You skip it right away. You don't even bother reading it. You just look at it. You say, oh, this is a subject I don't want to do. I don't know, and you don't do it. And this is how you spread your time out evenly throughout the exam, and this is what you should aim to do. So again, look at the clock every 5 questions or so. Make sure you're on time. If you're not, then skip. And this has worked for many students. This is sort of tried and true, and this is why everyone recommends it. And from here, basically, sort of from this sort of general idea, what I want to do is I want to dive into our personal statistics. So like I mentioned, we have tens of thousands of students from all over the world we've had, and that has given us quite a bit of statistical data, which we've anonymized as requirements, and we've analyzed. And what I want to share with you today is the quantitative insight from our data. And so the first slide that we're looking at is basically all of the questions on our website, which is to say all of the answers that people have given. So the graph that we're looking at is a histogram or a density plot, whatever you like to call it. And basically the blue area under it sums to 1. And let me just try to explain what this means. So for example, the average time, if you take sort of all of the blue area, all of the area under the curve, and you look at the average, you see that it takes about 2 minutes for people to solve questions on our website on average. And this is what it should be. So this is a sanity check. This isn't anything new. It tells you that our questions are more or less calibrated to be on par with the GMAT in terms of level, because the questions on the GMAT take about 2 minutes. So that's great. But what's more interesting about this graph is that, as you can see, the distribution is not normal. And for those of you who I just talked Chinese to, then what that means is that it's not sort of exactly even to the left and to the right of the arrow. You can see that it's a bit biased. So there's a bit more of the curve to the left, and there's a bit less of the curve to the right. And if we quantify that, we can see that 50% of the questions take students less than 1.5 minutes to answer. And so I'll just say that again to let it sink in for a minute. Half of the questions that you do should take you less than 1.5 minutes to answer. And on the other hand, if we look at sort of the other side of the curve, then about 1/4 of the questions that you do will likely take you more than 2.5 minutes. And you can see that the scale goes all the way to the crazy end of 500 and 600 seconds. And please keep in mind that this isn't an actual exam. This is people practicing. So, you know, when you're practicing, it's okay to sort of spend more time on a question and try to solve it. So you can disregard sort of the long tail. But basically, you have, again, about half of the questions taking you less than 1.5 minutes. And about 1/4 of the questions should take you longer, should take you 2.5 minutes. And these are sort of going to be magic numbers for us for the next following slides. And the reason is this. So the previous graph, this graph, looked at all of the questions on our website. So we're not separating between questions that students got answered correctly and questions that students answered incorrectly. And so one of the interesting things to look at is to look at the difference in timing between that. And I'm sort of going to preempt the take-home message, which is that you should not spend too much time solving questions. And basically, as you can see, there's a difference between these two curves. So just to explain what we're looking at, the x-axis is the exact same as the previous graph, and so is the y-axis. What we've done here is we've separated questions that student got correct as opposed to questions that student got incorrect. So the blue graph is questions that students got incorrect, and the orange graph is questions that students got correct. And you can see that they're not exactly overlapping. They're not really 100% one on top of the other. And the blue graph is a little bit more to the right of the orange graph. And what that means, the interpretation of this, is that students spend longer on questions that they end up getting wrong. And we're going to go into interpretations in a minute. But basically what this means is that on the GMAT, you should be able to recognize what sort of question you're looking at. There should be sort of ideally, especially if you're not in the crazy 700 esoteric questions that the GMAT sometimes throws at you, if you're in the 600 level or less, or say up to the 650, even up to the 700 level sometimes, you should be able to recognize the concept the question is talking about very, very quickly. If you do, then there's a good chance that you're going to get that right, as we're going to show in a second. If you don't recognize what the question is asking you, then there's a very good chance that you won't answer the question correctly, that you'll just waste your time looking at it and thinking about it and playing around with it. Eventually, you may be narrowing down to 2 answers or so, guessing wrongly, which is a shame, which is something you shouldn't do. And so sort of what we did next is we took the graphs above and we sort of wanted to ask, well, I mean, you know, you sort of look at this graph here. And you sort of maybe see the two shapes, the two distributions, and you're sort of, well, okay, one's a little bit to the right, one's a little bit to the left. That doesn't tell me too much, honestly. Can we change this into an actual probability? So, you know, if you spend 50 seconds on a question, what is your probability of getting the question right? If you spend a ridiculous, I don't know, 3 minutes on a question, what is your chance of getting that probability right? And what we found, averaged over all of the questions, is that we find sort of like the magic numbers that we talked about before. And this is here. So if you spend less than 1.5 minutes or a little bit more, maybe up to 2 minutes on a question, then there's a very decent chance, say 60% to 70% chance, not 100, of course, ever, that you will get that question correct. And if you don't, if you spend more time, so once you pass like the 2-minute mark, once you pass the 2.5-minute mark, then your probability of getting the question correct is pretty much an even coin toss. And you know, we can break this down into different types of questions. I'm not going to do it here. We've done it sort of internally for our own personal interest. You can see different graphs for different types of questions, but the general take-home message from this is what I said before, is that if you know what you're doing when you're looking at a question, and you just need to follow the yellow brick road, as it were, then do it. You can take a bit more time if it's wordy, and if you're looking at equations and sort of you know what equations you need to work with, but the calculation is just taking you an extra 20 seconds or so, that's perfectly fine. But if after 30 seconds to 40 seconds to, heaven forbid, a whole minute of looking at a question, you're still in the I have no idea what I need to do with this zone, then that's a very, very hard signal to you to skip. And sort of that refers back to the question that someone asked in chat a few minutes ago. When you say, and I'll just read out the question, when you say skip the question, what do you mean? Because we can't leave any question unanswered. So when I say skip the question, it means choose an answer of A, B, C, D, or E. Just pick a random answer, whatever you like. and press next. And that is what skipping a question means. And the guessing strategies that go on behind the GMAT are very, very important. And there's an important comment in chat. You can't keep a 2.5 minute mark in each question. You should practice this. This should be sort of an internal sensation. We'll talk about this more a little bit as we go on. But you should develop an internal sort of monitor within yourself for when you're wasting time on a question and when you're not. And you can't check the 2.5 minute mark on each question, but you certainly know when you've been spending 30 to 40 to 50 seconds on a question and still have no idea what to do. And that is when you should skip. Sort of if you're at the 2.5 to 3 minute mark and you still don't know what to do, then that means that you should skip the question a long time ago. Sort of that is the way to interpret this. And sort of this is maybe take-home message number one, the most important take-home message number one from our data and also from our experience as teachers that we sort of share with you here today. And sort of again, so we're moving from, let's say, big averages to more and more specific data. So just going back a few slides. Here we're talking about all of the questions, sort of the distribution of time of all of the questions. Then we move on to looking at questions that students get right or wrong. We moved on to that to trying to figure out what the probability is for a given time. And now we're looking at every individual student. So we're no longer looking at averages of all the students together. What every dot on the graph shows is the timing of an individual student. And the x-axis is the time that that student spent on average on answers that they got correct. The y-axis is answers that that student spent on average on questions that they got incorrect. And what you can see is that the vast majority of dots are above the line. And here there's one specific example. So for example, in the red circle, the specific students spend about 100 seconds on questions they got right on average and about 150 seconds on questions they got wrong. The vast majority of our students are above the line. And that means that they have spent more time questions that they got wrong. So this isn't just an average effect. This isn't just sort of some kind of weird thing of you have a bunch of students that are really, really bad and take a long time and others that are really good. No, this is true for pretty much every one of our students. And when you quantify this, it's true for 90% of our students. So 90% of our students waste time that they shouldn't, with an average difference being 20 seconds. And there's a bunch of statistics behind the scenes that I won't get into, but this is another take-home message. So this relates back to what we said before. So for every single one of you, there is an optimal time that you sort of should be spending on questions. And sort of you can see that the dots on this graph are spread out. So they're between sort of the lower left-hand corner for students that work really, really quickly, the upper right-hand corner for students that work very, very slowly. And I really can't know in advance for you specifically what your optimal time is to spend on a given question. But I can tell you that you do have not necessarily an optimal time, but you do have a time range. So you have a range of time where you recognize a question and know what to do with it and get to the right answer. And once you wander from that range, you're going to be increasingly more likely to get it wrong, to just miss the point of the question. Okay, and so this is the interim summary. So this is where I'm going to sort of summarize what we've talked about so far, and then I'm going to go back to chat and see what questions we have there. This is also the opportunity for you to ask any questions if you have any. Take home number one is that students in general spend more time on questions that they get wrong. If you can get it and you can solve it quickly, there's a good chance that you'll be right. It's not 100% ever, but it is much, much better than further on. If not, if you recognize, and here I write at the 2.5 minute mark, ideally you'll recognize questions that you don't know how to deal with, that you don't understand much, much sooner, after 30 to 40 seconds max, and already at that point you'll skip them. And you have your own personal optimal time. So I unfortunately can't tell you right here off the bat without knowing you how much time you should take and what sort of methodology you should use, but you can. And this is your goal for your studies, and sort of we've built our platform to help you do it. But wherever you choose to study, this is something that you should do. So this is the summary so far. Let me go over to chat part there. So can you run spread? This is very for me to answer. Questions you get wrong. Get it easy. The audio apologize for that. How many questions can you get wrong? What type of question, as I mentioned? So easy questions hurt the score more. Do the ones. So in general, if you see an easy question, then you should always try to answer it. You should sort of skip or guess the easy questions, but you should feel much more free to do hard questions because they will score. So, educated maximize that get something school for be the practice. Sort of you the main business, which is skill and learning tools. How about now? Is it better now? Oh, I see. I think I need to plug in my earphones. 1 second, please. How about now? Is it good? All right, excellent. I plugged in my earphones. That seems to have helped. Okay, so how to take an educated guess. So one thing is that this is where your practice exams really kick in. And some people use the practice exams only to assess their scores, to assess. I'll get back to your question in a second, please. Some people use practice exams only to assess where they're at. So am I currently at a 650 or a 750 or at a 550, wherever you are? This is important, but this is not the main thing that the practice exam should be used for. The practice exam is your best tool to figure out your strategies and to answer your questions, specifically to maximize the number of questions you get right, which is, for example, by to figure out your guessing strategy. Did you reach the end of the exam with enough time? When you made mistakes on the practice exam, what types of mistakes did you make? And we're not going to go too deeply into that because that's a subject for a different webinar. But basically, that's the answer to your question, how to make the best educated guess. Let me just go back to the question that Suzmit, I think, asked. Apologies if I mispronounce your name. How many questions can you get wrong and still get a 48? The answer to that was it depends on which questions you get wrong. So easy questions hurt your score a lot more than do the hard ones. So if you see an easy question, do take the time to solve it properly, even if it takes you a bit of extra time, and they shouldn't because it's an easy question. If you get a hard question, then you should feel more comfortable at skipping it. Okay, next question. Does this mean we should focus more on the 500 to 700 level questions rather than 700 level questions while practicing? 100% yes. And there's another beautiful slide that the GMAT shows, and you should go check out the webinar, sort of the interview that we had with the GMAT. It's on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And they basically show that students tend to sort of have a normal curve on their score level. And what this means is that you're going to get the questions at your level right. You're going to get questions easier than your level right. And as you go to higher levels, you start to get questions more and more wrong. This shouldn't surprise you. But sort of what's going on behind the scenes there is that you don't even sometimes know how to approach the higher level question. So if your fundamentals are bad, then I would not recommend that you try to answer the harder questions. Now, if you've already reached the 500 to 700 level, so you already know how to solve let's call them medium questions, because these aren't easy questions anymore, then you should feel more comfortable looking into the more esoteric types of questions. There's all sorts of esoteric questions on the GMAT. So yes, so you should definitely practice on questions that are mid-range, that are about your level, and then on the hard questions. Okay, so we're going to continue with the main portion of the webinar now, and we're going to answer more questions later on during the Q&A. So what we've shown in the first part is what we've learned from our statistics, and I summarized it in a few bullet points that were on the previous slide. And the next part is going to talk a little bit about practical tools. So how you can improve your timing. And the first stage, first sort of adage, as it were, which is maybe a little bit hippie but true, is that you need to know yourself. And what specifically this means, excuse me, relates back to what pretty much everything I've been talking about so far. And so what does it feel like when I know exactly what to do? When I'm looking at a question, I understand the concept, I know what equations to do, all I need to do is plug and chug. What does it feel like when I'm there, as opposed to what does it feel like when I get lost in my head? And I've seen this with so many students doing during private classes, for example. They read a question, especially the long wordy questions, and they sort of get lost. They sort of start reading the first sentence, and then somewhere in the middle or towards the end, especially if it's like a 2 or 3 line sentence, they just don't remember what they read at the start. And this really hurts them. And so this is a sensation you need to develop for yourself. What do you feel like when you're stuck? And this is something that you need to work on when you develop this. And at what point should I give up on a question and guess? I think I've already talked about that quite a bit. And the second phase, the second sort of practical tool, which sort of builds on the first. So if the first is your metacognition, then the second is how you actually address this, how you actually. And this is what we talked about at the start of the webinar, is your toolbox, your cognitive flexibility. And so, for example, for wordy questions, what often helps with sort of getting them out of your head is to put them on paper, is to just translate them into equations. The same way that you sort of take summary notes in a reading comprehension passage, you can also take summary notes in a word problem. It might sound a little bit funny, but it's totally true. So if you have a long word problem that, I don't know, talks about Jake's income, then you can sort of write Jake income, J equals whatever that number is. And then sort of the next part of the sentence talks about Maria's income, and you can write M equals whatever. And then the next part of the sentence talks about, I don't know, the ratio of those. And so every single part of the sentence is a logical, let's call it bullet point, that you can just write down as an equation on your sketchpad. And this is something that really helps you get out of your head onto the paper and sort of cut down on that time. So this is an example for a tool that we teach that helps solve some of the problems that you recognize when you sort of practice solving questions on the GMAT. The other 2 bullet points are also very important. So which types of questions give me the most difficulty? You're always going to have a specific subject that you're weaker in. We talked about guessing strategies. Unless you're aiming for a 750, it's probably going to be perfectly okay to skip a few questions during the exam. So you may as well choose in advance to skip the questions that you have no idea what to deal with. And so, for example, a classic strategy is to say, well, there's only 3 or 4 geometry questions on the exam. I'm just going to skip the entirety of geometry. This is a bit like drastic. I wouldn't recommend doing this. But, especially if you're aiming for something in the 500s or the 600s, the low 600s, then you can probably be pretty safe skipping all of geometry and just focusing on everything else in quant. And what types of mistakes do I need to be careful to avoid? And this is especially important for those of you who make silly mistakes. So take the time to make sure you're answering the right question. And this isn't a joke. People make mistakes because they answer the wrong question, or because they mark the wrong answer, or because they miss some kind of calculation along the way. If you're aiming for a 750, you cannot skip questions. No, if you're aiming for a 750, you need to know the material pretty much perfectly, hope for the best, and sort of be super focused on exam day. Let me just take a few minutes to answer the questions here on chat. Assume below are the questions sequence and verbal, CR, if I answer them correctly, next sentence, will it be in the range of 650 to 800? I really can't answer that question because A, it's a different topic, so you've switched from critical reasoning to sentence correction. These are different chunks and the GMAT treats them differently. But if you got your first 2 critical reasoning questions correct, then I can pretty much guarantee that the third question is going to be of a higher difficulty. If you look at ESR of students, this is the enhanced score report, that you see that the GMAT usually starts off at the medium to high level, or medium-ish level in terms of questions, and then it sort of shoots up to medium, high, or high very quickly if you answer questions correctly. And then there's one more question that I'm going to pause for a moment to answer. I find that my accuracy in answering verbal questions reduced drastically because I try to finish it within 1.5 minutes, whereas I could have done it correctly within 1:45 if I was not worried about time. I see. How should I approach? So approach number 1, the easiest approach is the guessing strategy, which is to say, if you guess a certain amount of questions on the exam, then you have more time to answer all of the other questions. And sort of that's the easiest way to gain time on the GMAT. That is 100% what I recommend to students who are not aiming for the super high 700s, is to just guess questions so you have enough time to answer the questions. The other way to do it is to recognize which questions to spend more time on and which to spend less time on. The other approach is to sort of not worry about time and only chunk the time. So look at the clock every 5 questions, and if you're late, then skip a question, and if not, then continue on going. All right, I'm going to continue on going because it's already 10 till, and this is technically supposed to end in 10 minutes. So I think we're going to show one example question. I don't think I'm going to have time for the other example question, and then we're going to skip straight to the Q&A because it is important that we have how to handle stress. Stress is a really good question, which I'll talk about later. So again, I'm going to do one more example question, and then we're going to skip straight to the Q&A. So of the 900 guests that attended a wedding, 36% were women. If 450 men left the wedding, the women would be what percentage of the remaining guests? Now, this question is probably one that you sort of have a really fast, let's call it intuition as to how to solve. So for example, you could just straight up calculate it. So if 36% of the 900 guests were women, then that means that it's 36 over 100 times 900, 36 times 9. You do a bit of algebra to calculate this, and you get to 324 women in the wedding. And then, well, okay, so 450 men left the wedding. So then that means that there are 450 guests remaining. And then the percentage of the remaining guests, this is unfortunate, you need to, the woman would represent the remaining guest. You need to calculate 324 over 450. So, you know, you can stare at this for a while. Eventually recognize that there's a factor of 3 in there that you can cancel out. You get to 36 over 50, 72%, answer choice D. This is what we call the precise approach, for those of you who remember from way back when at the beginning of the webinar. So this is basically looking at the equation, translating it into, looking at the question, translating it into equations, and then basically solving it, sort of solving it explicitly as you might do in a high school exam or so on and so forth. And this works. This always works because the questions on the GMAT are always solvable. So you're not going to see research questions that you don't know how to solve, that no one knows how to solve. You're going to solve questions that have an answer. And the problem with this specific approach, and I think one of the people wrote in chat earlier, is that equations take them a long time. And this is why. I mean, just look at the screen for a moment. You needed to calculate 36 times 9 in the middle of all this. Then you needed to calculate 324 divided by 450. Before you did all that, you sort of need to figure out which equations to write and how to calculate. This just takes a long, long time. And this is, again, going back to developing different tools, cognitive flexibility, then this works but can take a while, and there's a different, faster solution approach. And so in this specific case, percentage is defined as the part over the whole. So at the start you had the percentage of the women over all of the guests, whatever that is, and you don't have to calculate that at the start. And what we want to find is the percentage of the women at the remaining guests. So if half of the guests left, and all the guests that left were male, that means that you have the exact same number of women, but they're only over half of the guests. And that means that you have twice the percentage. So that means that you can directly skip from 36% to 72% without having to go through all the calculation. And I just sort of want to go up a few slides just to sort of show you visually the difference between the two solutions. So the sort of the plug and chug type solution to this equation had to go through all of that, and which can take a while. And we're going to talk about how long this takes in a second. But it works. But you know, it can take a while. And a deeper understanding of the material, which is the more logical approach, for those of you who remember, can solve the question much, much, much faster. And this is basically because the question solver, hopefully you, looked at the question and asked, what can I do to answer this question quickly? And sort of arrived at a flash judgment about that and did not jump directly into answering the question. So again, going back to our metacognitive tools, then this is what you need to develop. So this is sort of stage 2 of learning. So if stage 1 learning was first learning all of the equations and learning everything on this slide, stage 2 of learning is learning to differentiate between the two, is to realize when you can use a specific tool, which will be faster than a different tool. And if we're talking about timing, then the first solution that I showed took students on our website. And again, this is like a real question on our website with real students and real timings. It took about 2.5 minutes, maybe because the algebra is so hard. And the second solution took only a bit less than 2 minutes. It took a while primarily because it can take a while to sort of see the logic behind the answer. But once you do, it takes much less time to calculate. And this is crazy. This is sort of a 40% or a 33% reduction or a 40% increase, depending which direction. But it's 40 seconds that you could have saved just by using a different tool. And to answer the person who said that it takes him 1:45, if he spends 1:45, he's cool, and if he spends 1.5 minutes, he's not cool, then possibly one approach is to learn tools that just take you less time in order to solve. Okay, and sort of the goal of this example question, the next one, which I won't go into, is to show that there are better solution tools often. And we're sort of going to skip this example, which is sort of Another example of a fast tool versus a slow tool. This is obviously the slow tool. Look at all that math. And then this is obviously the fast tool. Look at how fast it is. And we're not going to talk about that. The last thing that we're going to, the last data slide is this one. This is sort of a sampling of the questions on our website. And every single question here that's above the line is a question that you can save time on. So we've pointed out the 2 examples. The x-axis is the fastest solution that we found. The y-axis is the one that students found most natural. Or more do most quickly. And you can see that there are quite a few questions. Again, this isn't all the questions, this is a sampling of them, but there are quite a few questions that are directly on the line, which means that our students have figured out how to approach the question quickly. But there are quite a few questions where the most common solution tool is not actually the fastest way to solve the problem. And sort of, this is the final data slide of this webinar. It's also the summary in one case. It's sort of the proof that you can improve your timing just by building up your cognitive flexibility, just by increasing the amount of tools that you have. Okay, so let's sort of summarize everything that we've talked about today, and then the rest of the webinar is going to be Q&A, which I think I'm going to extend by 5, maybe 10 minutes, depending on how many questions people have and how interested they are. So take-home message number 1. Are you taking longer than usual to solve a question? Skip it. And a different way to think about this is, have I been looking at a question for 30 to 40 seconds and I still have no idea what to do? This is probably a question that I don't know what to do with. I should skip it. This is number 1. Number 2 is, how many tools do I have in my toolbox? Do I have only the equation-related tools? Can I only pick numbers? Both of these answers are bad if they're true. A good answer is a diverse one. I have many, many tools. And the third part is, how do I use these tools? So are there specific types of methods that work better for me? Are there specific problem types that I always make mistakes on? Are there specific traps that I tend to fall into? And so this relates to the metacognition, sort of how do I use all the tools that I have available? So these are the main take-home messages for today.
ExamPal,